Chapter 2. First Interrogation. Kay was informed by telephone that next Sunday a short inquiry into his case would take place. His attention was drawn to the fact that these inquiries would now follow each other regularly. Perhaps not every week, but at more frequent intervals as time went on. It was in the general interest, on the one hand, that the case should be quickly concluded, but on the other hand, the interrogations must be thorough in every respect, although, because of the strain involved, they must never last too long. For this reason, the expedient of these rapidly succeeding but short interrogations had been chosen. Sunday had been selected as the day of inquiry so that Kay might not be disturbed in his professional work. It was assumed that he would agree to this arrangement, but if he preferred some other day, they would meet his wishes to the best of their ability. For instance, it would be possible to hold the inquiries during the night, although then Kay would probably not be fresh enough. At any rate, they would expect him on Sunday, if Kay had no objection. It was, of course, understood that he must appear without fail. He did not need to be reminded of that. He was given the number of the house where he had to go. It was a house in an outlying suburban street where he had never been before. On receiving this message, Kay replaced the receiver without answering. His mind was made up to keep the appointment on Sunday. It was absolutely essential. The case was getting underway and he must fight it. This first interrogation must also be the last. He was still standing thoughtfully beside the telephone when he heard behind him the voice of the assistant manager, who wanted to telephone and found Kay barring his way. "Bad news?" asked the assistant manager casually, not really wanting to know, but merely eager to get Kay away from the telephone. No, said Kay, stepping aside but without going away. The assistant manager lifted the receiver and said, speaking round it while he waited to be connected, "Oh, a word with you, Kay. Would you do me the favor of joining a party on my yacht on Sunday morning? There will be quite a large party. Doubtless some of your friends will be among them. Herr Haster, the lawyer, among others. Will you come? Do come." Kay made an effort to attend to what the assistant manager was saying. It was of no slight importance to him, for this invitation from a man with whom he had never got on very well was a sort of friendly overture and showed how important Kay had become to the bank and how valuable his friendship, or at least his neutrality, had become to its second highest official. The assistant manager had definitely humbled himself in giving this invitation, even though he had merely dropped it casually while waiting at the telephone to get a connection. Yet Kay had to humble the man a second time, for he said, "Thanks very much, but I'm sorry I have no time on Sunday. I have a previous engagement." "A pity," said the assistant manager, turning to speak into the telephone, which had just been connected. It was not a short conversation, but in his confusion, Kay remained standing the whole time beside the instrument. Not till the assistant manager had rung off did he start out of his reverie in some alarm and say, to excuse his aimless loitering, "I've just been rung up and asked to go somewhere, but they forgot to tell me at what time." "Well, you can ring up and ask," said the assistant manager. "It isn't so important as all that," said Kay, though in saying so he crippled still further his first lame excuse. The assistant manager, turning to go, went on making remarks about other topics. Kay forced himself to answer, but what he was really thinking was that it would be best to go to the address at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning, since that was the hour at which all the law courts started their business on weekdays. Sunday was dull. Kay was tired, for he had stayed late at his restaurant the night before because of the celebration. He had nearly overslept. In a great hurry, without taking time to think or coordinate the plans which he had drawn up during the week, he dressed and rushed off, without his breakfast, to the suburb which had been mentioned to him. Strangely enough, though he had little time to study passers-by, he caught sight of the three clerks already involved in his case, Rabensteiner, Kulich, and Kaminer. The first two were journeying in a streetcar which crossed in front of him, but Kaminer was sitting on the terrace of a cafe and bent inquisitively over the railing just as Kay passed. All three were probably staring after him and wondering where their chief was rushing off to. A sort of defiance had kept Kay from taking a vehicle to his destination. He loathed the thought of chartering anyone, even the most casual stranger, to help him along in this case of his, although he did not want to be beholden to anyone or to initiate anyone even remotely in his affairs. And last of all, he had no desire to belittle himself before the court of inquiry by a too scrupulous punctuality. Nevertheless, he was hurrying so as to arrive by 9 o'clock if possible, although he had not even been required to appear at any specific time. He had thought that the house would be recognizable even at a distance by some sign which his imagination left unspecified, or by some unusual commotion before the door, but Juliusstrasse, where the house was said to be, and at whose end he stopped for a moment, displayed on both sides houses almost exactly alike, high gray tenements inhabited by poor people. This being Sunday morning, most of the windows were occupied. Men in shirt sleeves were leaning there, smoking or holding small children cautiously and tenderly on the window ledges. Other windows were piled high with bedding, above which the disheveled head of a woman would appear for a moment. People were shouting to one another across the street. One shout just above Kay's head caused great laughter. Down the whole length of the street, at regular intervals below the level of the pavement, there were little general grocery shops, to which short flights of steps led down. Women were thronging into and out of these shops or gossiping on the steps outside. A fruit hawker who was crying his wares to the people in the windows above, progressing almost as inattentively as Kay himself, almost knocked Kay down with his pushcart. A phonograph, which had seen long service in a better quarter of the town, began stridently to murder a tune. Kay penetrated deeper into the street slowly, as if he had now abundant time, or as if the examining magistrate might be leaning from one of the windows with every opportunity of observing that he was on his way. It was a little after 9 o'clock. The house was quite far along the street. It was of unusual extent. The main entrance was particularly high and wide. It was clearly a service entrance for trucks. The locked doors of various warehouses surrounded the courtyard and displayed the names of firms, some of which were known to Kay from the bank ledgers. Against his usual habit, he studied these external appearances with close attention and remained standing for a little while in the entrance to the courtyard. Near him, a barefooted man was sitting on a crate reading a newspaper. 2 lads were seesawing on a hand-barrow. A sickly young girl was standing at a pump in her dressing jacket and gazing at Kay while the water poured into her bucket. In one corner of the courtyard, a line was stretched between 2 windows, where washing was already being hung up to dry. A man stood below, superintending the work with an occasional shout. Kay turned toward the stairs to make his way up to the court of inquiry, but then came to a standstill again, for in addition to this staircase, he could see in the courtyard 3 other separate flights of stairs, and besides these, a little passage at the other end which seemed to lead into a second courtyard. He was annoyed that he had not been given more definite information about the room. These people showed a strange negligence or indifference in their treatment of him. He intended to tell them so very positively and clearly. Finally, however, he climbed the first stairs, and his mind played in retrospect with the saying of the warder Willem that an attraction existed between the law and guilt, from which it should really follow that the court of inquiry must abut on the particular flight of stairs which Kay happened to choose. On his way up, he disturbed many children who were playing on the stairs and looked at him angrily as he strode through their ranks. If I ever come here again, he told himself, I must either bring sweets to cajole them with or else a stick to beat them. Just before he reached the first floor, he had actually to wait for a moment until a marble came to rest. 2 children with the lined, pinched faces of adult rogues holding him meanwhile by his trousers. If he had shaken them off, he must have hurt them, and he feared their outcries. His real search began on the first floor. As he could not inquire for the court of inquiry, he invented a joiner called Lans. The name came into his mind because Frau Grubach's nephew, the captain, was called Lans. And so he began to inquire at all the doors if a joiner called Lans lived there, so as to get a chance to look into the rooms. It turned out, however, that was quite possible without further ado, for almost all the doors stood open, with children running out and in. Most of the flats, too, consisted of one small, single-windowed room in which cooking was going on. Many of the women were holding babies in one arm and working over the stove with the arm that was left free. Half-grown girls who seemed to be dressed in nothing but an apron kept busily rushing about. In all the rooms, the beds were still occupied. Sick people were lying in them, or men who had not wakened yet, or others who were resting there in their clothes. At the doors, which were shut, Kay knocked and asked if a joiner called Lans lived there. Generally, a woman opened, listened to his question, and then turned to someone in the room, who thereupon rose from the bed. The gentleman's asking if a joiner called Lans lives here. A joiner called Lans? Asked the man from the bed. Yes, said Kay, though it was beyond question that the court of inquiry did not sit here, and his inquiry was therefore superfluous. Many seemed convinced that it was highly important for Kay to find the joiner Lons. They took a long time to think it over, suggested some joiner who, however, was not called Lons, or a name which had some quite distant resemblance to Lons, or inquired of their neighbors, or escorted Kay to a door some considerable distance away where they fancied such a man might be living as a lodger, or where there was someone who could give better information than they could. In the end, Kay scarcely needed to ask at all, for in this way he was conducted over the whole floor. He now regretted his plan, which at first had seemed so practical. As he was approaching the 5th floor, he decided to give up the search, said goodbye to a friendly young workman who wanted to conduct him farther, and descended again. But then the uselessness of the whole expedition filled him with exasperation. He went up the stairs once more and knocked at the first door he came to on the 5th story. The first thing he saw in the little room was a great pendulum clock which already pointed to 10. "Does a joiner called Lons live here?" he asked. "Please go through," said a young woman with sparkling black eyes, who was washing children's clothes in a tub, and she pointed with her damp hand to the open door of the next room. Kay felt as though he were entering a meeting hall. A crowd of the most variegated people, nobody troubled about the newcomer, filled a medium-sized, 2-windowed room, which just below the roof was surrounded by a gallery, also quite packed, where the people were able to stand only in a bent posture with their heads and backs knocking against the ceiling. Kay, feeling the air too thick for him, stepped out again and said to the young woman, who seemed to have misunderstood him, "I asked for a joiner, a man called Lons." "I know," said the woman. "Just go right in." Kay might not have obeyed if she had not come up to him, grasped the handle of the door, and said, "I must shut this door after you. Nobody else must come in." "Very sensible," said Kay, "but the room is surely too full already." However, he went in again. Between 2 men who were talking together just inside the door, the one was making with both outstretched hands a gesture as if paying out money, while the other was looking him sharply in the eye. A hand reached out and seized Kay. It belonged to a little red-cheeked lad. Come along," he said. Kay let himself be led off. It seemed that in the confused, swarming crowd, a slender path was kept free after all, possibly separating 2 different factions. In favor of this supposition was the fact that immediately to right and left of him, Kay saw scarcely one face looking his way, but only the backs of people who were addressing their words and gestures to the members of their own party. Most of them were dressed in black in old, long, and loosely hanging Sunday coats. These clothes were the only thing that baffled Kay, otherwise he would have taken the gathering for a local political meeting. At the other end of the hall toward which Kay was being led, there stood on a low and somewhat crowded platform a little table set at a slant, and behind it, near the very edge of the platform, sat a fat little wheezing man who was talking with much merriment to a man sprawling just behind him, with his elbow on the back of the chair and his legs crossed. The fat little man now and then flung his arms into the air as if he were caricaturing someone. The fat little man now and then flung his arms into the air as if he were caricaturing someone. The lad who was escorting Kay found it difficult to announce his presence. Twice he stood on tiptoe and tried to say something, without being noticed by the man up above. Not till one of the people on the platform pointed out the lad did the man turn to him and bend down to hear his faltering words. Then he drew out his watch and with a quick glance at Kay, "You should have been here an hour and 5 minutes ago," he said. Then he drew out his watch and with a quick glance at Kay, "You should have been here an hour and 5 minutes ago," he said. Kay was about to answer but had no time to do so, for scarcely had the man spoken when a general growl of disapproval followed in the right half of the hall. "You should have been here an hour and 5 minutes ago," repeated the man in a raised voice, casting another quick glance into the body of the hall. Immediately the muttering grew stronger and took some time to subside, even though the man said nothing more. Then it became much quieter in the hall than at Kay's entrance. Only the people in the gallery still kept up their comments. As far as one could make out in the dimness, dust, and reek, they seemed to be worse dressed than the people below. Some had brought cushions with them, which they put between their heads and the ceiling to keep their heads from getting bruised. Kay made up his mind to observe rather than speak. Consequently, he offered no defense of his alleged lateness in arriving and merely said, "Whether I'm late or not, I am here now." A burst of applause followed, once more from the right side of the hall. These people are easy to win over, thought Kay, disturbed only by the silence in the left half of the room, which lay just behind him and from which only 1 or 2 isolated hand claps had come. He considered what he should say to win over the whole of the audience once and for all. or if that were not possible, at least to win over most of them for the time being. "Yes," said the man, "but I am no longer obliged to hear you now." Once more the muttering arose, this time unmistakable in its import. For, silencing the audience with a wave of the hand, the man went on. "Yet I shall make an exception for once on this occasion, but such a delay must not occur again, and now step forward." Someone jumped down from the platform to make room for Kay, who climbed onto it. He stood crushed against the table. The crowd behind him was so great that he had to brace himself to keep from knocking the examining magistrate's table and perhaps the examining magistrate himself off the platform. But the examining magistrate did not seem to worry. He sat quite comfortably in his chair, and after a few final words to the man behind him, took up a small notebook, the only object lying on the table. It was like an ancient school exercise book, grown dog-eared from much thumbing. "Well then," said the examining magistrate, turning over the leaves and addressing Kay with an air of authority, "you are a house painter." "No," said Kay, "I'm the chief clerk of a large bank." This answer evoked such a hearty outburst of laughter from the right party that Kay had to laugh too. People doubled up with their hands on their knees and shook as if in spasms of coughing. There were even a few guffaws from the gallery. The examining magistrate, now indignant and having apparently no authority to control the people in the body of the hall, proceeded to vent his displeasure on those in the gallery, springing up and scowling at them till his eyebrows, hitherto inconspicuous, contracted in great black bushes above his eyes. The left half of the hall, however, was still as quiet as ever. The people there stood in rows facing the platform and listened unmoved to what was going on up there as well as to the noise in the rest of the hall. Indeed, they actually suffered some of their members to initiate conversations with the other faction. These people of the left party, who were not so numerous as the others, might in reality be just as unimportant, but the composure of their bearing made them appear of more consequence. As Kay began his speech, he was convinced that he was actually representing their point of view. "This question of yours, sir, about my being a house painter, or rather not a question, you simply made a statement, is typical of the whole character of this trial that is being foisted on me. You may object that it is not a trial at all. You are quite right, for it is only a trial if I recognize it as such. But for the moment I do recognize it on grounds of compassion, as it were. One can't regard it except with compassion if one is to regard it at all. I do not say that your procedure is contemptible, but I should like to present that epithet to you for your private consumption." Kay stopped and looked down into the hall. He had spoken sharply, more sharply than he had intended, but with every justification. His words should have merited applause of some kind, yet all was still. The audience were clearly waiting intently for what was to follow. Perhaps in that silence an outbreak was preparing which would put an end to the whole thing. Kay was annoyed when the door at the end of the hall opened at that moment, admitting the young washerwoman who seemed to have finished her work. She distracted some of the audience in spite of all the caution with which she entered. But the examining magistrate himself rejoiced Kay's heart, for he seemed to be quite dismayed by the speech. Until now he had been on his feet, for he had been surprised by Kay's speech as he got up to rebuke the gallery. In this pause he resumed his seat very slowly, as if he wished his action to escape remark. Presumably to calm his spirit, he turned over the notebook again. "That won't help you much," Kay continued. "Your very notebook, sir, confirms what I say." Emboldened by the mere sound of his own cool words in that strange assembly, Kay simply snatched the notebook from the examining magistrate and held it up with the tips of his fingers as if it might soil his hands. By one of the middle pages, so that the closely written, blotted, yellow-edged leaves hung down on either side. "These are the examining magistrate's records," he said, letting it fall on the table again. "You can continue reading it at your ease, Herr Examining Magistrate. I really don't fear this ledger of yours, though it is a closed book to me, for I would not touch it except with my fingertips, and cannot even take it in my hand." It could only be a sign of deep humiliation, or must at least be interpreted as such, that the examining magistrate now took up the notebook where it had fallen on the table, tried to put it to rights again, and once more began to read it. The eyes of the people in the first row were so tensely fixed upon Kay that for a while he stood silently looking down at them. They were without exception elderly men, some of them with white beards. Could they possibly be the influential men, the men who would carry the whole assembly with them, and did they refuse to be shocked out of the impassivity into which they had sunk ever since he began his speech, even though he had publicly humiliated the examining magistrate? What has happened to me, Kay went on, rather more quietly than before, trying at the same time to read the faces in the first row, which gave his speech a somewhat disconnected effect. What has happened to me is only a single instance, and as such of no great importance, especially as I do not take it very seriously, but it is representative of a misguided policy which is being directed against many other people as well. It is for these that I take up my stand here, not for myself. He had involuntarily raised his voice. Someone in the audience clapped his hands high in the air and shouted, "Bravo, why not? Bravo, and bravo again." A few men in the first row pulled at their beards, but none turned round at this interruption. Kay, too, did not attach any importance to it, yet felt cheered nevertheless. He no longer considered it necessary to get applause from everyone. He would be quite pleased if he could make the audience start thinking about the question and win a man here and there through conviction. "I have no wish to shine as an orator," said Kay, having come to this conclusion, "nor could I if I wished. The examining magistrate, no doubt, is much the better speaker. It is part of his vocation. All I desire is the public ventilation of a public grievance. Listen to me. Some 10 days ago I was arrested in a manner that seems ridiculous even to myself, though that is immaterial at the moment. I was seized in bed before I could get up, perhaps. It is not unlikely, considering the examining magistrate's statement. Perhaps they had orders to arrest some house painter who was just as innocent as I am. Only they hit on me. The room next to mine was requisitioned by 2 coarse warders. If I had been a dangerous bandit, they could not have taken more careful precautions. These warders, moreover, were degenerate ruffians. They deafened my ears with their gabble. They tried to induce me to bribe them. They attempted to get my clothes and underclothes from me under dishonest pretexts. They asked me to give them money, ostensibly to bring me some breakfast after they had brazenly eaten my own breakfast under my eyes. But that was not all. I was led into a third room to confront the inspector. It was the room of a lady whom I deeply respect, and I had to look on while this room was polluted. Yes, polluted on my account, but not by any fault of mine, through the presence of these warders and this inspector. It was not easy for me to remain calm. I succeeded, however, and I asked the inspector with the utmost calm if he were here. He would have to substantiate that, why I had been arrested. And what was the answer of this inspector, whom I can see before me now as he lounged in a chair belonging to the lady I have mentioned, like an embodiment of crass arrogance? Gentlemen, he answered in effect nothing at all. Perhaps he really knew nothing. He had arrested me, and that was enough. But that is not all. He had brought 3 minor employees of my bank into the ladies' room, who amused themselves by fingering and disarranging certain photographs, the property of the lady. The presence of these employees had another object as well, of course. They were expected, like my landlady and her maid, to spread the news of my arrest, damage my public reputation, and in particular shake my position in the bank. Well, this expectation has entirely failed of its success. Even my landlady, a quite simple person, I pronounce her name in all honor, she is called Frau Grubach. Even Frau Grubach has been intelligent enough to recognize that an arrest such as this is no more worth taking seriously than some wild prank committed by stray urchins at the street corners. I repeat, the whole matter has caused me nothing but some unpleasantness and passing annoyance, but might it not have had worse consequences? When Kay stopped at this point and glanced at the silent examining magistrate, he thought he could see him catching someone's eye in the audience as if giving a sign. Kay smiled and said, "The examining magistrate sitting here beside me has just given one of you a secret sign. So there are some among you who take your instructions from up here. I do not know whether the sign was meant to evoke applause or hissing. And now that I have divulged the matter prematurely, I deliberately give up all hope of ever learning its real significance. It is a matter of complete indifference to me, and I publicly empower the examining magistrate to address his hired agents in so many words, instead of making secret signs to them, to say at the proper moment, 'Hiss now,' or alternatively, 'Clap now.'" The examining magistrate kept fidgeting on his chair with embarrassment or impatience. The man behind him, to whom he had been talking, bent over him again, either to encourage him or to give him some particular counsel. Down below, the people in the audience were talking in low voices, but with animation. The 2 factions who had seemed previously to be irreconcilable were now drifting together. Some individuals were pointing their fingers at Kay, others at the examining magistrate. The foggy atmosphere in the room was unbearable. It actually prevented one from seeing the people at the other end. It must have been particularly inconvenient for the spectators in the gallery, who were forced to question the members of the audience in a low voice, with fearful side glances at the examining magistrate to find out what was happening. The answers were given as furtively, the informant generally putting his hand to his mouth to muffle his words. "I have nearly finished," said Kay, striking the table with his fist since there was no bell. At the shock of the impact, the heads of the examining magistrate and his advisor started away from each other for a moment. I am quite detached from this affair. I can therefore judge it calmly, and you, that is to say, if you take this alleged court of justice at all seriously, will find it to your great advantage to listen to me. But I beg you to postpone until later any comments you may wish to exchange on what I have to say, for I am pressed for time and must leave very soon. At once there was silence. So completely did Kay already dominate the meeting. The audience no longer shouted confusedly as at the beginning. They did not even applaud. They seemed already convinced or on the verge of being convinced. There can be no doubt, said Kay quite softly, for he was elated by the breathless attention of the meeting. In that stillness a subdued hum was audible, which was more exciting than the wildest applause. There can be no doubt that behind all the actions of this court of justice, that is to say in my case, behind my arrest and today's interrogation, there is a great organization at work, an organization which not only employs corrupt warders, oafish inspectors, and examining magistrates, of whom the best that can be said is that they recognize their own limitations, but also has at its disposal a judicial hierarchy of high, indeed of the highest rank, with an indispensable and numerous retinue of servants, clerks, police, and other assistants, perhaps even hangmen. I do not shrink from that word and the significance of this great organization, gentlemen. It consists in this, that innocent persons are accused of guilt and senseless proceedings are put in motion against them, mostly without effect, it is true, as in my own case. But considering the senselessness of the whole, how is it possible for the higher ranks to prevent gross corruption in their agents? It is impossible. Even the highest judge in this organization cannot resist it. So the warders try to steal the clothes off the bodies of the people they arrest. The inspectors break into strange houses, and innocent men, instead of being fairly examined, are humiliated in the presence of public assemblies. The warders mentioned certain depots where the property of prisoners is kept. I should like to see these depots, where the hard-earned property of arrested men is left to rot, or at least what remains of it after thieving officials have helped themselves. Here Kay was interrupted by a shriek from the end of the hall. He peered from beneath his hand to see what was happening, for the reek of the room and the dim light together made a whitish dazzle of fog. It was the washerwoman, whom Kay had recognized as a potential cause of disturbance from the moment of her entrance. Whether she was at fault now or not, one could not tell. All Kay could see was that a man had drawn her into a corner by the door and was clasping her in his arms. Yet it was not she who had uttered the shriek, but the man. His mouth was wide open and he was gazing up at the ceiling. A little circle had formed round them. The gallery spectators nearby seemed to be delighted that the seriousness which Kay had introduced into the proceedings should be dispelled in this manner. Kay's first impulse was to rush across the room. He naturally imagined that everybody would be anxious to have order restored, and the offending couple at least ejected from the meeting. But the first rows of the audience remained quite impassive. No one stirred and no one would let him through. On the contrary, they actually obstructed him. Someone's hand, he had no time to turn around, seized him from behind by the collar. Old men stretched out their arms to bar his way, and by this time Kay was no longer thinking about the couple. It seemed to him as if his freedom were being threatened, as if he were being arrested in earnest, and he sprang recklessly down from the platform. Now he stood eye to eye with the crowd. Had he been mistaken in these people? Had he overestimated the effectiveness of his speech? Had they been disguising their real opinions while he spoke? And now that he had come to the conclusion of his speech, were they weary at last of pretense? What faces these were around him! Their little black eyes darted furtively from side to side. Their beards were stiff and brittle, and to take hold of them would be like clutching bunches of claws rather than beards. But under the beards, and this was Kay's real discovery, badges of various sizes and colors gleamed on their coat collars. They all wore these badges so far as he could see. They were all colleagues, these ostensible parties of the right and the left, and as he turned around suddenly, he saw the same badges on the coat collar of the examining magistrate, who was sitting quietly watching the scene with his hands on his knees. "So," cried Kay, flinging his arms in the air, his sudden enlightenment had to break out. "Every man jack of you is an official, I see. You are yourselves the corrupt agents of whom I have been speaking. You've all come rushing here to listen and nose out what you can about me, making a pretense of party divisions. and half of you applauded merely to lead me on. You wanted some practice in fooling an innocent man. Well, much good I hope it's done you, for either you have merely gathered some amusement from the fact I expected you to defend the innocent, or else keep off or I'll strike you, cried Kay to a trembling old man who had pushed quite close to him. Or else you have really learned a thing or two, and I wish you joy of your trade. He hastily seized his hat, which lay near the edge of the table, and amid universal silence, the silence of complete stupefaction if nothing else, pushed his way to the door. But the examining magistrate seemed to have been still quicker than Kay, for he was waiting at the door. A moment, he said. Kay paused, but kept his eyes on the door, not on the examining magistrate. His hand was already on the latch. I merely wanted to point out, said the examining magistrate, that today you may not yet have become aware of the fact. Today you have flung away with your own hand all the advantages which an interrogation invariably confers on an accused man. Kay laughed, still looking at the door. You scoundrels, I'll spare you future interrogations, he shouted, opened the door and hurried down the stairs. Behind him rose the buzz of animated discussion. The audience had apparently come to life again and were analyzing the situation like expert students.